We've been using the dope sheet up until now to help facilitate the creation and placement of our keyframes in our timeline itself. For example, if I grab my little cube here on my timeline, you can start to see the location of all the keys that I've created for my little animation. The dope editor or the dope sheet does a great job. It excels in establishing kind of that macro view of our animation. It defines where the keyframes are, but it doesn't allow us to really control the contents of the key. It doesn't allow us to control the values that are inside the keyframe. All it does is establish that there is a keyframe and when that keyframe is placed on our timeline. It's not really a tool for us to fine-tune the movement. Thus, enter the graph editor. Here's the challenge that we have. I've gone ahead and blocked out a very simple Pong animation, and generally speaking, it's okay. However, if we were to zoom in here, we have some big time challenges that we need to overcome. Watch what happens when the cube hits that first paddle. It doesn't actually, let me zoom down a little bit here. See how it scoops? It ice skates. It actually moves on an arc. It goes in an arc movement, which isn't what I want. I want it to hit and then move and then rotate off almost like in an angular path. I don't want it to move in an arc in this particular movement. The the dope sheet is not going to allow us to go in and fine tune the movements themselves. We can change this by some very simple adjustments to what are called function curves in the graph editor. All roads lead to the graph editor. Your animation is not done, in my opinion, until we have gone in and adjusted all the function curves for our graph editor. It really is the environment that gives you the very best and strongest results. However, it requires us to look at our animations very differently. Let me show you what the graph editor environment looks like and the benefits of working in this unique environment. Okay, getting into the graph editor can be done two ways. Easily, down here in our animation workspace, doing Control Tab is automatically going to flip between the dope sheet and the graph editor. Cool, huh? Pretty neat. The dope sheet, critical for laying the foundation for our keys. The graph editor is going to bring to the surface the actual values and expose how the computer is transitioning between these values. In every sense, we're visualizing the interpolation between these two keyframes, how the computer is transitioning between keyframe A and keyframe B. The other way that we can get to the graph editor, because it is technically its own editor itself, is in this part of the interface. Let me see if I can zoom in so you guys can see. So we're looking at the dope sheet, and the dope sheet actually has a number of different sub-sheets inside of it. The action editor, the shape kit, the grease pencil tools that we've seen in Animation 301, all here in this editor. The graph editor, however, is a very different beast. You can find it under the animation category right here. So I like doing Control Tab, but there are a couple different ways of getting into the graph editor space itself. Welcome to working with the graph editor. Admittedly, it is a unique object unto itself. Much like the dope sheet, you want to make sure that this blue arrow is turned on. That way you're only seeing the function curves, these little spaghetti noodles, for the objects that are selected and that you have keyed. What you're seeing in the graph editor is very similar to what we're accustomed to seeing in the dope sheet, just laid out slightly different and is exposing the actual interpolation between these values. Once again, we're seeing a similar hierarchy, one that we saw in the dope sheet. We're seeing the actual object itself, and then we're seeing the action, the data container, if you will, for our animation keyframes. We're seeing the transform channels that we've keyed, X and Z. What's different about this is that we're no longer seeing individual keyframes on the dope sheet. Remember, this is what we are used to seeing, right? Just these lovely little circles. Now what we're seeing is the actual interpolation of the values themselves, how the computer is transitioning between keyframe A and keyframe B. This is going to take a little getting used to. It's like reading, it's like learning a new language. After a while, you'll start to be a little bit more fluid in there. So trust me and trust your own self and trust the process that you will get into this as you go. So let me define how this works really fast. This is a graph editor. And so instead of plotting keyframes along time, we're now actually looking at the keyframes in time. So left and right is going to be time. So this is frame 1, this is still frame 10. So reading the graph left to right, that is our time ruler, if you will. up and down, the vertical axis, this is a value ruler. So we're working with location information on this one. So up and down are meters in the scene. So this is the first one that we keyed in. If I was to zoom out and look at my transform channels real fast, you can see that the location of the small cube at this moment in time is negative 1.2. If you look very carefully on the graph, yeah, I mean, if this is 0 and this is negative 5, yeah, that's probably negative 1.2 or something very similar. So the vertical is going to be value. The horizontal is going to be time. Now we get to navigate around this graph very, very easily. We're to use the same viewport navigation controls that we're used to seeing in the rest of our environment. So if I did Option Shift, I can pan my graph left and right, up and down. If I do Option Control, and this is probably the most important one, we can zoom in. Now I'm going to left click and drag, okay? Horizontally, excuse me. So if I left click and drag, left and right or horizontal, okay, while holding down Control Shift, you can see I'm zooming in on time. Now it's 36, frame 36, frame 36 and a half, frame 37. So we're magnifying time. We're slicing each individual frame into its own smaller bit. Now, if I was to do the same zoom, Control Shift and go up and down with my mouse, check it out. Now I'm magnifying the value. Okay. Look over here. Our value slider at the moment is 8 and 6. If I zoom in vertically, now I see 8, 7, 6. Eventually there's 6, 5.5. So we're getting more and more detail as we zoom in vertically and horizontally. So keep that in mind. One small thing that we can do to make our lives working with the graph editor a little bit easier, is remember some of our keyboard shortcuts. We can select all of our keyframes, hit the period key on the number pad, and it's going to frame the selected keys inside the window itself. That's a good one to commit to memory. I like using that one. Okay, so if all you see is that, just select everything. You hit the A key to select all the keyframes. Hit the period key on your number pad. And it's going to frame the selected keyframes inside the window itself. One other thing about the graph editor to be mindful of as we continue to work inside this very unique environment are all the visibility of the channels themselves. What is overwhelming about the graph editor are all the different function curves. We're only working with 2 animation channels. As we get into more complex rigs, you're going to have 10 or 15 of these on one object. Well, one character is going to have 60 different objects that we're all animating. So the sheer volume of function curves that are visible at any moment of time can be a thing. So luckily for us, the developers down at the Blender Foundation have given us the ability to filter and turn off and on the visibility of function curves to make it easier for our simple little brains to manage all this data. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to move over here a little bit. Let me zoom out as well in a little 2-bit. There we go. Apologies. There we go. All right. So if I click on one, so here's X location. It's highlighted. It's brought to the surface. If nothing's selected inside of my scene, everything's going to be kind of ghosted, which I really enjoy. That makes it easy for me to select something and understand that the one that's more saturated in color is the channel that I'm currently working on. If it's way too much, because right now I can see the red line for the X, the blue line for the Z, turn off the visibility of the Z. There's nothing wrong with that. Make it easy for your brain to understand and see all of these little curves as they go in and out of all of these keyframes. So definitely turn off the visibility of all of this. You can also turn off or turn on and off these little check marks. This actually disables the channel. So don't get fooled by this. A lot of folks kind of stumble on this on accident. They go, oh, I can just turn it on and off here. Well, this is the left and right movement of our cube. We have disabled the animation along that channel. Now, if I was to scrub my timeline, yep, it goes up and down, but it doesn't go left and right because I disabled that channel or I deactivated it. Now with it on, now my little cube starts to go left and right. So don't get caught in that little pitfall. This physically mutes the channel. The eyeball deactivates its visibility in the graph, but it keeps its function. Oops, I turned them all off. I apologize. Now, see how it's still going now? Even though we turned off the visibility of the X in the graph, we're still evaluating all of those keyframes. So keep that in mind as you're working and customizing the function of your graph editor to make it easier for you to work with. Now, when working with our keys in our graph editor, I want to zoom in here, see if we can see it a little bit more easily. Okay. So that right there is a keyframe. The dot that's filled in, that solid black, is a keyframe. This is one that either you added by hitting the I key on your keyboard or the auto key system added for you. Each key is going to get these little tangent handles, which allows us to change the slope and the weight of our function curves. More on that in a little bit. So keep that in mind. The black ones that are solid are the keys. And of course, we can change the value, but we can also change its location in time. Vertical is up and down, or the up and down vertical axis is the value that we added in, and left and right is time. So if you think about it, in the dope sheet, all we were doing was just moving this keyframe in time, but the graph editor allows us to continue to do that, but it also allows us to change the value that's associated with this keyframe. Let me zoom back out so you can see what this looks like. Moving that keyframe left and right is just going to change its location and time. Notice that that cube visually isn't moving within inside of our three-dimensional scene. However, if I was to grab it and move it along the vertical axis, let me move my playhead to that moment in time, excuse me. There we go. Yeah. Now, when I move this keyframe up and down, I'm changing the value inside the keyframe, and I'm physically changing its location inside of our three-dimensional space. This speaks to the power of the graph editor because it's kind of like the dope sheet, but like one level more awesome, right? We're still able to change the location of our keyframes in time, but now we're also able to change the values that are inside the keyframe, which is pretty great. Take a moment. Get accustomed to working in this environment. It's a lot of new information, and it takes a little bit of fluency to get good at it. Start that now. Just take a few moments, get the lay of the land, if you will, on how this graph editor works, because we're going to be using this to customize and create highly detailed animations that would normally be very difficult to create using the computer, but using the graph editor and intelligently changing these function curves is going to make our animations more realistic and more believable very easily.